Morning, everyone. Thank you so much for joining today's Fireside Chat. And today we have a very interesting topic, and we have Andre talking about role of private military and militia groups in conflict zones. Prior to heading to the today's topic, a little bit about the Asian Pathfinders. We are a knowledge sharing platform for scholars and practitioners. We have started in 2020 and we run our projects through our fireside chat, which are every Saturday morning, 11 to 12 o'clock, and the dialogues at the end of the last week of the month on Thursday evening, 5:30 to 7 o'clock. We are aimed to be an informal way to connect for peers with interest in the Asian region, and we are also a way for scholars and practitioners, especially young professionals, to present and learn from these sessions. Uh, this month we are holding a series on non-traditional security threats, and next week on Thursday on 26th August we have a panel discussion on recapping non-traditional security threats from today's context, and we have very eminent senior scholars joining from all over the world for this session. Few community guidelines: respect the views of others, but don't shy away from expressing yourself. Put your comments, share your thoughts in the chat box. We just do not allow participants to speak directly because we put these videos on the YouTube for wider audience further. And you can contact us, Pallavi and me, on the following Twitter IDs or email IDs. And today, to moderate the session, we have Tanishk Saxena. Just a second. Tanishk is interning with us since last 1 year after his completion in the masters. Tanishk, over to you. Tanishk, you're on mute.
Thank you, Shreyas, for the introduction. So today's topic under discussion is the role of private military and militia groups in conflict zones. For states entering a conflict zone means an extra burden, so needs a political will, incentives that could be beyond fear of legislation, and evaluated consequences taken into account with cost benefit. As the model of capitalism was expected to do, that Adam Smith rightly pointed, that economic agents that act in their self-interest deliver the best possible social and economic outcomes. Sometimes the security void left out by states in providing security is filled through private contractors in exchange of money. One of the interesting facts is that it is the second oldest profession of the world. These private contractors help states and corporations to mitigate risk and facilitate business continuity. These are employees of a private company performing tasks inherently militarily and are mostly highly skilled and trained ex-combatants. Sometimes these private contractors and missionaries pose a challenge for a foreign policy of a state. Other ongoing operations, peace and stability, sovereignty, and even the balance of power in the region. We may think these private contractors are limited to have operations in weak states with corrupt leaders or with fragile situation on rule of law. But a leading private military contractor website that I visited gives evidence of global outreach and capability to conduct operations globally. These corporations and machineries are rarely open to their operation, and they only give out in public what, according to circumstances, suits them for a good PR or a good public image. Liberal democratic states are expected to have due transparency under international law and are answerable to public under through domestic laws as part of regular checks and balances that these democratic states have. But under the same form of governance, these mercenaries and private contractors are protected under proprietary law. These mercenaries are not members of any treaty or convention, so there's limited liability and states seem protected seems protected until they really cross the borders. Thereby, their involvement in any conflict raises concerns. A renowned writer on the topic, P.W. Singer, in his book Corporate Warrior, points out as the private contractors walk with the line of legality with the potentially illegitimate clients, business practice with illegitimate business practices, and employees with dark pasts. I could think with that of 6 different types of military, private military that operate globally. So one of them is the big contractors that are headquartered either in USA, South Africa, Russia, or some other part, and they have involved themselves in conflicts in Sierra Leone, Croatia, Balkan states, and even Crimea. Then there are mercenaries that that could be said to be smaller contractors, may be found in any part of world. For example, those involved in assassination attempt of Haiti president. Third are contractors that facilitate business continuity and security, such as Chinese contractors that are working for Chinese ambitious project, BRI, or Belt and Road Initiative, or the CPEC, China-Pakistan Economic Corridor in Pakistan. The fourth one are the South American revolutionaries or the terrorist groups or the cartels that also have a social cause or a political ambition or involve themselves in drug trades and others, but also provide security to business operations if asked to, otherwise in form of extortion. And then there comes the wide-eyed lunatics or religiously misguided extremists or motivated through an ideology for monetary benefit involve themselves in some other way or at different places, such as foreign fighters in Syria for ISIS, or with Kurds, or fighting in Syria for monetary incentives originating from UAE or Saudi, acting as a proxy. And the last one are the extreme right-wing organization, hardline conservatives, vigilant groups, such as some working on US-Mexico border. They also take in arms and does act similar to military or any other law enforcement border management agencies. And that was all from my side. And to speak more on the topic, we have Professor Andres joining us from Colombia. A brief introduction about Professor. Andres Macias received his PhD in Peace and Conflict Studies from Tokyo University of Foreign Studies in Japan. He completed an MA in the same field at the same university and a BA in Government and International Relation from Universidad Externado de Colombia. He is currently full-time professor and researcher at Universidad Externado de Colombia, and his main research areas are public policy analysis in security and defense, privatization of security, armed conflicts and post-conflict studies, and the studies on drugs and crimes. He has also conducted consulting activities for UNODC, IUM, and the Colombian National Department of Planning and other national organizations. Professor, your opening remarks.
Thank you very much, Tanishk and Shreyas and the Asian Pathfinders for inviting me to this very interesting session. And thank you for such a very kind introduction. Well, yeah, I'm going to talk to you about this very interesting topic that Tanishk has already addressed some brief issues. It's a very interesting and complex topic to understand, to a point in which there's not so much academic production and literature as there is, for example, of military or of regular armed forces. I'm going to explain a little bit why there's not so much literature about this topic. Only until recently, after the 21st century, the beginning of the 21st century, there was a huge boom on more literature regarding this topic. But well, I will let you know why this happened. I'm going to share some short slides so that the presentation, I hope, goes a bit more smoothly. I'll try to keep on time, but Tanishk, please feel free to stop me whenever I need to stop. Okay, so talking about the role of private military and militia groups, especially in conflict zones, is, as I mentioned, a very interesting topic. Although these actors, private military, militia groups, and other private security groups, as Tanishk mentioned before, are not new, are not only related to conflict zones. We also see this type of groups in different environments, even in peace building initiatives. And therefore, when we might address this topic from a broader point of view, we might talk about this as the privatization of security, or as examples of privatization of security. Although today I'm going to address only these two actors. And to begin talking about this topic, the first thing that comes to mind is this idea that we might have, at least in school, and it's related to when we talk about states, and especially about modern states, we automatically think, or in many cases, we might think that when we talk about states, we are talking about an actor, a community that has a monopoly on the legitimate use of force. It's very common to say modern state is a synonym or is related to the monopoly on the legitimate use of force. However, this is not entirely true. There are a lot of examples in which we might say that there are very few states that might actually have that monopoly on the legitimate use of force. Let's say that it's more of the exception than the rule, the fact that states have the monopoly on the legitimate use of force. There's a lot of other providers, non-state providers, that provide military and security services to the state and to other actors. And if there is another actor besides the state that provides military and security services, then maybe there is no monopoly, because the definition of monopoly says that only one provider exists. However, in this sense, why do we then think that state and monopoly on the legitimate use of force are synonyms or are always together? Mainly because of this definition, old definition of Max Weber, that said something related to that. But his definition was more related to the fact that states claimed, or the path of states to become modern states and to become successful modern states was that they wanted to claim, or they followed a path in which they claimed something similar to a monopoly on the legitimate use of force. It was as if they obtaining and claiming that monopoly was their main goal, their main objective. But his definition is not that a modern state equals monopoly. Okay, this is a very important issue, at least from an academic point of view. From a political point of view, well, we would have a lot of discussions and debates. In that sense, this idea that the state has or claims the monopoly on the legitimate use of force within its boundaries, within its territory, is related to the fact that states have a military force, a public force, a police force. And in that sense, this is the actor controlled by the state that provides security and defense in that territory. However, this might seem for many as normal, as the obvious thing. In fact, there are many other actors that also provide military and security services for a state, and even more, provide these services in conflict scenarios, in conflict zones, to go to combat, to go to war. Two of these actors are private military companies and militia groups. There are many others, but today we are going to address only these two. And there's an important difference, and that's why, as you will see, I will focus more on private military companies than on militia groups. I will let you know why. But mainly, these two have a big difference, and the main difference from military force is that these two are composed of civilians. Civilians that know about warfare, civilians that have military experience, but that are not part of regular military forces. Okay, this is the main difference between both of them. And actually today, states all around the world, mainly except some as perhaps in North Korea, all of states around the world have to some extent relied on private military companies or private security companies and on militia groups to go to war or to provide military and security services. And when we talk about these civilians providing military services to a state or to other clients, the first idea that we have is that these are mercenary actors. These are mercenary companies. These are mercenary groups, as Tanishk also addressed. But are they really mercenaries? Do we actually know what the mercenary is? The fact is that mercenaries are a concept that is very common, but we don't actually know what it is. And it's very common that mercenaries have a negative connotation. That when we say when we talk about mercenaries, when we say that someone is a mercenary, in many cases we are always trying to say that that person is doing something negative, because there's always a negative connotation regarding mercenaries. The fact is that mercenaries were not so weird or were not so strange in warfare throughout history, even in recent history. I here have a timetable in which I show more or less the evolution towards the regulation of mercenaries, because mercenaries today are regulated, are prohibited. There's a UN convention that says that mercenaries cannot be recruited, used, or financed, or trained in any context around the world. But this convention entered into force only in 2001. So before 2001, mercenaries were not illegal. Mercenaries were used by states. Okay, remember this date, 2001. Only after 2001, mercenaries were illegal. For some of us, that might be very strange, because mercenaries have always been sort of negative. But in fact, history shows that they have always been involved in conflict zones throughout history and in recent history also. Only after the Second World War, within the Geneva Conventions, and especially the additional protocols of the Geneva Conventions, started to say that mercenaries were maybe not the best actors that states could rely on to go to war. And therefore, they started to define what a mercenary was, and they didn't prohibit mercenaries. What they did, this additional protocol did was that it took away some privileges that regular military forces had in order to separate and differentiate mercenaries from regular military forces. One of those examples is a regular military force has, for example, the prisoner of war status. A mercenary does not have that status after this Article 47 of the Additional Protocol 1 of the Geneva Conventions. Okay, they were not illegal, but they would not have the benefit of prisoner of war. In 1977, also within Africa, a convention to try to eliminate mercenarism was put into place. So mercenarism was tried to be abolished from Africa. And at that time, there was a UN group that started to analyze what was the idea or what was the role of these mercenaries involved in conflict zones. And these discussions led to the draft of a UN convention in 1989. So in 1989 was the first time that a United Nations convention was drafted against the use of mercenaries, but it took 12 years to enter into force. Why? Because there was no political will from most states around the world to sign this treaty, this convention, because many states used and relied on mercenaries. The fact is that today, in 2021, we have more or less 35 or 36 countries that have signed the international convention. Most of them African countries, some Latin American countries, some Asian countries, but United States has not signed it. The UK, France, many of those developed countries have not signed this convention. So the convention exists, but it's not so applicable around the world. And I mentioned this convention because the convention defines what a mercenary is. And the mercenary is what? Is a person, is not a group. So when we are talking about private military groups and militia groups, groups are not mercenaries. Mercenaries are persons. Okay, first thing to take into account. A mercenary can be recruited to fight in an armed conflict or to undermine the government of a country. And an important thing in this sense is that they need to have some material compensation. But two interesting things in this sense. What happens if you hire a company not to participate in an armed conflict, but you hire it to defend infrastructure? You hire it to defend civilians. If you are defending civilians in a conflict zone, you are not hired to participate in the conflict. You are hired for defensive activities. The problem is that, obviously, if you are hired for defensive activities in a conflict zone, in the long run, you will be involved in the conflict. But the contract says that you are not hired to participate in the conflict. You are hired to provide defensive services. And the other interesting thing is that the material compensation has to be substantially superior than that of a regular soldier of the similar rank. So in many cases, many of these companies, militia groups or private military companies, provide salaries, but they are very careful not to fulfill this second characteristic of a mercenary, providing salaries lower than soldiers of similar ranks. And if a person, although the person is fighting an armed conflict, does not fulfill all these 5 characteristics of what a mercenary is, they will not be a mercenary for the international law or for this international convention. This is a very interesting thing. The other characteristics of this definition are, let's say, normal or regular for what we might understand of what a mercenary is. Now, going back into private military companies, normally we address them as PMSCs, or private military and security companies. They started to exist formally around the 70s. There are some examples before, but let's say that in the 70s, they started to become important, or they started to become a big boom around the world. The UK was one of the countries that provided most of these companies. One of these is the one of 1976, created by Colonel Sir David Stirling. These companies started to have a huge boom after the Cold War. I will tell you why. And in this boom, only companies based in the United States were able to sign contracts with the US government between 1994 and 2002 for a total value of over $300 billion, only with the Department of Defense. It's a huge money. And if we add that to the Department of State, we have even more. And when we add that to all the other countries that hire this type of companies, the amount is huge. It's the magnitude is very, very high. Another interesting thing is that most of these companies pay important money for these employees of the companies. Around 2004, in Iraq and Afghanistan, employees of private military companies could earn between $500 and $1,500 per day. Who would not want this money? It's very, very, the incentives are huge. It's a lot of money for a one-day work. And also in Iraq and Afghanistan, that are 2 of the most well-known scenarios where these companies have been participating in the conflict, have or gathered around employees of 30 different nationalities. It's let's say that the labor force for these companies is from all around the world. These companies have increased, especially after the Cold War, a huge amount of money in contracts, doubling every 5 or 10 years the total amount of contracts signed with states and with other clients, and of all the public contracts, because there are many contracts that are not so public. So the money and the value of the industry has grown a lot, and also the amount of employees hired by this industry, to a point in which, for example, meanwhile, during the first Gulf War, for every for every 100 soldiers that were deployed into the conflict, there was 1 private employee. By 2008 and 2009 in Iraq, there were, for every soldier, there was 1 employee of a private military company. And if we talk about that today, well, following what, for example, happened in Afghanistan, we have more private employees than military force fighting conflicts around the world. Why do I talk so much about the end of the Cold War? Because by 1990, the end of the Cold War saw a very interesting phenomenon. Most developed countries downsized their defense sectors, and by downsizing their defense sectors, they reduced the budget, and in that sense, there was an increase in the supply of trained workforce because many members of regular armed forces stopped having a job, stopped being part of a regular armed force. If they stopped working for states as a regular armed military employee, as a regular military, then the market had an increase in the supply of trained workforce. And also at the end of the Cold War, new wars developed in different parts of the world. A new neoliberal tendency arrived to privatize everything of the state, to make the state as small as possible. And this tendency to privatize also arrived to the security sector. And then came 2001, war on terrorism. These three elements called for an increase in the demand of trained workforce. And when we have a supply and we have a demand, we have a huge network for the increase of the industry, the corporatization of this industry. That's why from 1990 on, this industry grew a lot all around the world. Before this time, it was very common to see these ads. During all the 20th century, we are looking for mercenaries. Volunteers needed to go to fight in war. These were mercenaries, they were not illegal, and it was a huge workforce. Later on, in recent years, we started seeing this. Foreign fighters sent to certain territories, as in this case, Russia sent some private company, Wagner company, to do a certain job in a certain territory. I mean, I'm not going to go into these details. We might discuss them later if you want. But we started seeing this. This is from last year. We started seeing how it became a very important discussion topic around the world in high political elites. We saw that also in the Central African Republic, we see a huge amount of violence, and in that sense, what is the role of this violence, or who is behind this violence, or what are we doing to confront this violence? Well, we rely on private military companies to facilitate transport and security in order to help the government, because the government cannot deal with violence. Until we see, as Tanishk also mentioned today, a scandal in the last month in which former Colombian military have been accused of being behind the killing and the murder of Haiti President Jovenel Moise. Former military soldiers hired by a private company called CTU from Miami, and therefore we start dealing with a lot of private actors, so-called mercenaries, but all of them employed by private military companies, participating in conflicts, in violence, or in different violent scenarios. And they act in a very weak regulation framework. There is no regulation for private military companies. They are legal companies, legally constituted, with legal contracts for the employees of the companies. There have been initiatives to prohibit these companies that have not worked out, as in South Africa and Switzerland. There is no international regulation. The only thing that exists is perhaps the international humanitarian law, but this is interesting. International humanitarian law focused on what happens in the middle of armed conflicts separates combatants from civilians. Combatants are regular military forces, regular armed forces. Private military companies and militia groups are civilians. They are not combatants. So even for international humanitarian law, the presence of these groups is very weird. They cannot be called combatants. However, if they are not combatants, they are civilians, but they are civilians with weapons that participate in hostilities. So international humanitarian law is a bit behind the evolution of warfare, in which we have combatants, regular armed forces, we have civilians that we need to protect, and we have civilians that participate in the conflict. How do we deal with them? Well, international humanitarian law sees them as civilians participating in hostilities. And in this sense, we see a lot of examples of these actors in conflict zones. Blackwater, one of the most famous companies, today called Academy because of the scandals, of all the scandals it has had throughout history, accused of participating in violation of human rights, torture, as the one in Abu Ghraib. There's a lot of the documentation in this sense. Shootings and mass murders, as it happened in Mysore Square in 2007, destruction of private property. Well, there are a lot of examples. Blackwater might be one of the main examples of the negative elements, of the negative aspects of the presence of these companies in conflict zones. But we also have the other side, executive outcomes in Sierra Leone. Today, executive outcomes does not exist anymore. Executive Outcomes was a South African company composed mainly of former South African soldiers of the apartheid regime. They were hired in Sierra Leone to push away the RUF rebels. And in 9 days, they were able to do almost all the things that they were hired to. They pushed the RUF, they were able to control Freetown, and in 10 months, they did what the Sierra Leone government and the Sierra Leone military force could not do. That was take again one of the regions of the country that had diamond mines. This has been maybe as one of the positive positive results of the presence of private military companies in conflict zones. We have then another example, DynCorp in Colombia. Colombia, a conflict zone. DynCorp was hired not to fight against rebels, not to fight against insurgents. It was hired to help air spraying in Colombia. So we have Blackwater, negative consequences in Iraq and Afghanistan, executive outcomes, positive results in Sierra Leone. DynCorp, a company that was hired to support the activities of the government against drug trafficking. Obviously, drug trafficking is related to criminal groups in Colombia, but their main aim was not to participate directly in the conflict. However, their participation in Colombia led to an indirect participation in the conflict, attacking the financial sources of rebel groups. And we also have United Nations. United Nations hiring private companies in peacekeeping operations. Weird, but happens. And it's not illegal, but it's not also entirely legal. A huge discussion in this sense. So my time is summing up. So what is one of the main objectives or one of the main results of private contractors and militia groups in conflict zones? First of all, they facilitate foreign policy. States that cannot send military to another country to do peacekeeping operations or to promote the interests of that state with or using military means. Well, the United States, for example, cannot send military to Colombia or cannot send military to other countries because their Senate, their Congress will not allow it. Well, the United States can send private contractors because they can hire private companies without having or needing the permission of the US Congress. Perfect. It facilitates foreign policy, especially from a military point of view. It also reduces political costs. I can send private contractors instead of military forces, and the people that will die will not be nationals of my country. I will not lose votes. I will not be accused of sending my military to a country, to a war that is not mine. It reduces political costs. It is also a way in which all warfare around the world is changing. Today, most conflicts are not fought only with regular forces. Even inside civil wars, the ones that fight regular, the actors that are fighting or participating in conflict zones are not only civilians that are fighting in a civil war or regular armed forces participating in a conflict. We have civilians, we have regular forces, and we have private actors, and we have militia groups outside of any international legal framework. Is this a play of supply and demand? Obviously. And one of the main elements or factors in this sense is, do you know who produces weapons around the world? Countries do not produce weapons. Most of the main producers of weapons around the world are private companies. So when a state buys weapons from another state, that's more or less how we see that in different reports. It's not actually a state buying from another state. It's a state buying from a private company. Most of the weapons production around the world is a private industry. It's not a state industry. In this sense, we are dealing with private contractors and militia groups in a scenario without regulation. There is no regulation. This doesn't make everything legal, but neither illegal. There is a huge vacuum in this sense. Is there a tendency to privatize warfare? Yes, totally. It's cheaper, it facilitates foreign policy, reduces political costs. It's perfect. Is this a threat to security? Is the presence of private contractors and militia groups a threat to security? Some people see that in that sense, but for others, it's also a support for military action. As for example, the United Nations, supporting its peacekeeping operations with private contractors. In many cases, it's a support, it's a help for military action. This also calls us to think of a new concept of modern states. Going back to my first slide, modern states is related to monopoly and the legitimate use of force. This is the main characteristic that many people have in their heads. But if then states do not have really the monopoly and the legitimate use of force, then what is a state? A state then is a community of people that, how do they provide protection and defense for themselves? If the state does not have the monopoly, then should we redefine a state? Is the presence of private contractors and militia groups going to oblige us to redefine the concept and the notion of modern states? Maybe going back to earlier stages when there was no monopoly. Going back to when mercenaries were the main base of what we know today as states. Thank you very much for your attention. I give the word to Tanishk to see how we will address. There's a lot of things to continue debating in this sense. There's little time, but it's very interesting. So feel free to ask anything or comment anything.
Yeah, thank you, Andrés. It was really well presented, and particularly where you distinguish between mercenaries and the private contractors. So, but I have a question that like while these mercenaries and these private contractors operate, so what's the like behind their success, like where they success and what's behind their failure? Why do they like, no one would like they like if a company is like even that Blackwater off, if they are deploying somewhere, they won't want to involve in any situation. So what's behind that? Is there some lack of motivation or something that makes them to violate these human rights and stuff?
Well, it's a very complicated question, but the thing is that since, from my point of view, I believe that since there is no real regulation, then most of these actors do not really know their limits. So it's very easy to go over those limits, especially in a warfare, because regular armed forces go to warfare, go to conflict zones, and they know their limits, or they are obliged to follow those limits. But these companies do not have a chain of command. And many researchers in Iraq and Afghanistan have seen how when you ask military forces, how is their relationship with private actors, private military companies, they say the chain of command is not really clear. So there's a huge question in that sense. But on the other side, many of the people, civilians that are being affected by conflicts around the world, in some cases, they've seen that their government does not help them, their military does not protect them, they are being affected by insurgent groups or rebel groups, and maybe these private companies that have no interest, no political interest in the conflict, might be their only salvation, because these actors do not have interest in the conflict. They are less, in some cases, less prone to be corrupt people, corrupt actors. So maybe they provide a better security service. So we have this dilemma, and it's very complicated to solve or to generalize in one specific scenario.
I do have one more question, and then I'll take the question from audience. So do you see some relation between fragile states, weak policing, and the illegal drug trades and so on, and these contractors?
Well, yeah, and I will talk from the experience in Colombia. As I mentioned, for example, DynCorp was hired here in Colombia to do air spraying over illegal crops, cocaine, marijuana, and these illegal crops. So their objective was attack by illegal crops. They are so close to this illegal network that many of those employees were captured at the airport with drugs, with heroin, cocaine. So they get involved in these illegal markets because they are very close to these things, to these incentives of illegal revenue. And I would say that it's not so uncommon. If we go to the other side of, for example, the United Nations, blue helmets, within the blue helmets, we have also seen a huge, a lot of cases in which blue helmets have been accused of human trafficking. So it's very difficult to say that people involved in conflict are totally unaware of illegal activities, that they are all totally, they reject totally and always illegal activities. They are so close that it's very possible that some of them might end up involved in illegal activities.
Thank you, Andres. Now I'll take questions from audience. First question is from Moira. She asks Dr. Macias, considering that private security activities are more acceptable to the public compared to the private military activities, shouldn't there be a differentiation between the two, or it is unavoidable due to a significant overlap over both roles? Many companies take on both roles, hence the categorization as PSMCS. Do you think these two activities should be distinct from each other, especially in terms of establishing a legal framework? What could possibly regulate these types of activities?
Well, yeah, from an academic point of view, it's easier to gather both private security and private companies as a whole group. But as you say, more in fact, they have different activities, and there are many countries that have national security and national private security industries. In Latin America, we have a lot of private security companies, private security and surveillance companies, and there's a regulation for these companies providing private security, bodyguards, and well, here in Colombia it's very common. That's why I talk about this a lot. But as you also mentioned, there are huge companies, multinational companies that provide both military and security services. For example, one of the biggest ones is G4S. I don't know if you've seen that company. G4S provides security companies inside states, provides alarms for cars, alarms for houses, but they also provide military services in conflict zones. So if we can differentiate that these two industries, it will be easier to regulate them, and it's easier to regulate private security companies providing security inside states, mainly because most of these companies have to have some sort of national permissions and national permits. But when we go to the international arena, it's very complicated because we need to go to states to agree how to regulate these companies. And that will never happen, or at least very far away, because there's no political will. Most powerful countries rely on these companies to exercise their foreign policy in other countries. So yes, it's possible. Yes, it should be done. When it can be differentiated, it's possible to regulate the local national security companies. But since this is a globalized industry, providing military services, it will be very difficult to regulate at an international level.
Yeah. Even I do think that it would take a long time to reach Geneva, like as we have issues on cyber and still pending. So another question is from Pallavi. Are these PSMCs a way of states bypassing their claim of neutrality in conflicts? Also kindly comment on the role of Wagner Group in conflicts in Africa.
Yeah, it's totally a way of bypassing neutrality. And that's why, for example, Switzerland wanted to abolish Swiss private military companies, because they didn't want to be involved in conflicts only by having a private company nationalized in their country. So yes, it's a way to bypass neutrality, or to bypass political or legal obstacles inside the country, as United States using their military to go to another country. The Congress will not allow it, so you send military, private military companies. So yes, it's a way of bypassing that. I'm not well. Yeah, I'm not so knowledgeable about Wagner company in Africa. I've known about Wagner in Asia. This presence of Wagner sent by Russia in certain territories. I just saw a bit of Wagner in Libya. Once again, a way in which Russia was exercising its presence in a territory in which, if Russia had been there with military, a third World War would have appeared. But no, they sent Wagner. Wagner is a private company doing private things. But in reality, there are a lot of political interests behind that. Also, for example, in Venezuela, Wagner has been accused, or there's a scandal of Wagner having presence in Venezuela in the border with Colombia. Once again, behind that is Russia sending private actors and private military power towards the border with Colombia, an ally of the United States, Colombia allied of the United States. We have these private companies that are exercising Russian power allied with Venezuela in the border. If Russia had sent their military, chaos would have arrived. But since it's Wagner, it's not so bad, not so complicated. So more or less, that's what's been happening with Wagner. One of the most used private companies by Russia in different conflict zones or different interesting territories for Russia today.
Yeah. So thank you. So I had like one question that came up in my mind with this answer that you gave, is that like we are talking about it in terms of land conflict, but as this world is like growing every day, and so we also have cyber threats, and we do have like privatization of space, conflicts in seas, and over global commons. So where does these private companies fit to these things?
They have a huge scope of business in this sense, because these companies have a lot of money and they can invest a lot of money in cyber technology. They can invest a lot of resources in cyber weapons or cyber, in general, cyber technology, to a point in which, for example, many years ago, intelligence services and intelligence within conflict zones was executed mainly by states, intelligence from the states. We had spies, we had different human technology and human information controlled by states. But today, who is capable of providing intelligence information for states and for any other client? Many private companies. Private military companies, or in general, private companies have a lot of this information used for intelligence, maybe for market things, for market purposes, but also for warfare purposes and for conflict purposes. So the market is huge for private military companies, but in this sense, as you mentioned, Tanishk, for private companies in general that have the capability of collecting information. Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, these are private companies that have information that can be used for intelligence that is very close to cyber technology, cyber violence, cyber terrorism, or cyber defense.
So thank you. We have a question from Anvesha that's regarding the accountability of these firms, and then we have question from Oliver on legitimacy of these firms. So if you could like give briefly about like club the answers up. So she also asked like how inclusive is the formation of international law on this aspect. I think you have covered most of it, but if you want.
Yeah, but it's very interesting. In theory, if anyone commits a war crime, he or she should be prosecuted. within national laws or within international laws. You can go to the International Criminal Court and all these issues. The fact is that no employee of any of these companies have been accused of a war crime to the extent of going to the International Criminal Court, because let's say that if one of these companies participates in a conflict and commits a war crime, there are national laws that would apply. In this case, what has happened, as for example, the case of Abu Ghraib or the shootings of Blackwater in Iraq, these guys might have been accused of a war crime, but the legislation and all the process led to the fact that these people were protecting a military convoy. So they were not really committing a war crime. They committed a crime, and therefore they need to be prosecuted. And they were prosecuted under United States law. Since they were prosecuted, then some sanction might appear. Maybe not the same sanction that a war criminal might have been accused of in front of the International Criminal Court. So accountability is very, very, very weak, mainly because of this, all this legal infrastructure that these private companies know to handle very well. And within the absence of an international regulation, this accountability will never take place. However, and going back to what Oliver mentioned, these companies are legitimate because they are legal. They are legally constituted in a country. They pay taxes. They have regular contracts. And remember that not all of these companies commit crimes. Not all of these companies have negative results in their presence in conflict zones. In many cases, they provide intelligence, they provide training, they provide a lot of positive things without which military forces could not operate. So not all of these companies are negative actors in conflict zones. To the point that since there is no international regulation, there is an international code of conduct, a voluntary code of conduct based on certain standards. You can Google that. It's the International Code of Conduct. So companies that are abide to this International Code of Conduct, they tell to their clients, we follow these standards. So there's no regulation, but we have some standards that we will never cross. And this tries to build some legitimacy to their presence in different scenarios, including conflict zones. And international law, well, it's very complicated to do something in this sense, because we have international humanitarian law, and we have nothing else. And international humanitarian law is very limited to all the extent of what these companies can have. So yes, we need to work a lot in this international law, in the formation of international law, but we need political will. And today there is not so much political will within powerful states, because the powerful states rely a lot on private companies, private military companies.
So there's a question from Shreyas. So it is the private heavily armed security personnels are used to deploy on large cargo ships for protection. Does the shipping company still use them? Could you please explain more on this? So I've also read on this, like in Somalia, these private companies do like escort these. So could you like shed more light on that?
Yes, totally. And yes, the answer is they still do that. And well, if you've seen movies, at least, if you have not seen that person, but this movie of Captain Phillips is very close to reality. So we see one of these ships being attacked by pirates or by actors. And today, that type of threats is amazing. So there's a lot of them. And the problem is that maybe they are not the old pirates that steal the goods and go away, but they hijack the ships, or they hijack the cargo of the ship. And this turns out to be very expensive, because then if there's a hijacking, then the ship has to stay in port for a long amount of time, and the companies that own these ships lose a lot of money. So the companies prefer to have to pay a lot of insurance to insurance companies to insure the cargo, and in order to reduce risks, then the insurance company hires private security companies. The cargo vessel also hires private security companies, because when we add the cost of hiring private companies and paying for the insurance, it would be less than all the amount of money that would be lost if one cargo vessel is hijacked and is stopped in a port for months. So yes, in this sense, these private companies turn out to be the solution for a security problem that the international community has not been able to stop. And Somalia and Nigeria are certain specific points where a lot of these attacks occur, and the world cannot do a lot against them. Private security companies, in this sense, turn out to be a solution. I don't know if the best solution, but at least a solution.
So there's one more question from Pallavi. So she asked, like, on based of what you say, what we discussed. So providing security for citizens, we have citizens coming together to protect themselves and their communities, as seen in Mexico. So would you say these groups as private military?
They are militia groups. They are not private military companies because they are not formally constituted as a company. Because private military companies are the same as any other commercial company. They pay taxes, organized, they have an accountant, they have a president. This example that Pallavi mentions is just a natural formation of civilians that see that the state is not capable of defending or protecting them, and they create their own group to protect them. They could be militia groups, they could end up being paramilitary groups, or they could end up being insurgent groups. But these actors that in general terms are illegal because they are outside of the law, providing security on their own terms and not under the legal terms of the state, most of them are illegal, but private companies are totally legal. And that's the main issue here. They are legal, but in a global industry that has no regulation for them. Very complicated.
Yeah, thank you, Andres. So with like a last question that would be asked. So I would like to ask you about the relation between cryptocurrency and this industry. So a lot of money laundering that happens that I think facilitate this way. Or what would you say about, what would be your comment on it?
Sorry, Tanishk, I lost a bit your question.
It's on cryptocurrency. How like this industry is related to cryptocurrency, or does it benefits, like how would it be? And money laundering.
Very complicated question, but I would guess that most of the money involved in hiring these companies is public, most. However, there are a lot of non-public contracts that allow the possibility of money laundering because they are contracts that cannot go through the proper channels. So money laundering would be the best way to solve this impossibility of making contracts public. That's one thing. But there's another thing, is that these companies, as legal companies, who controls who their clients are? No one, because because of this legal absence of legal framework. So what happens if a criminal organization hires one of these companies? It's very unclear. And in that sense, then once again, how are they paid? It's very unclear, very obscure, and leaves the door open to a lot of possibilities, including, for example, money laundering.
Thank you. So like with this answer, I'll pass on to Shreyas. And I think like ethics has a lot to do when we talk about these issues. So Shreyas, over to you.
Thank you. Thank you, Tanishk. And as I said, it's a oldest profession, but still there are many gray areas in this profession while understanding this. private military business. And I think that comes when we were discussing, and Dr. Macias explained all the laws surrounding them, because we are living currently a law-driven world, in the globalized world, and that's why we are facing all these questions, and technology is adding into this more complications. So thank you so much, Dr. Macias, bringing out all these positives and negatives of this business, and we really appreciate your time and joining us today at this odd hours of yours in your country, in Colombia. And Tanishk, thank you so much for this wonderful moderation. Thank you so much. And thank you so much, everyone. And we are looking forward to see you next Thursday. Do join us for the next session on recapping non-traditional security threats from today's context. That will be on next Thursday from 5:30 to 7 o'clock. Thank you so much, and have a good weekend ahead.
Thank you. Goodbye. Good afternoon.
Thank you, everyone.